everyone, and welcome. My name is Rebecca Chavez. I'm the president and CEO of Inter-American Dialogue. For those of you who don't know us, we are focused on advancing democratic governance, shared prosperity, and social equity in the Americas. And we're so grateful that you're joining us for today's discussion about the future of Venezuela. And also thank you so much to everyone who's joining us online. So we're going to be talking about what's next after the October 22nd primaries for next year's presidential election. We all know that they were a milestone. Over 2.4 Venezuelans went to the polls, showing clearly that there is still a strong appetite for democracy in the country, and that if allowed to vote, Venezuelans will express themselves peacefully. A majority, over 90%, I'm looking right at her on the screen, chose María Corina Machado. Hello. The opposition candidate. But she remained arbitrarily disqualified from running for office based on an administrative process that violates fundamental rights. Given the Maduro regime's low popularity, it's not surprising that the primaries have made many of those in power nervous. In response, the regime has charged the primaries, top organizers with crimes, including violation of electoral rules, identity theft, money laundering, and conspiracy, and later used the very pliant, subservient Supreme Court in an attempt to nullify the primaries. The vote took place just 5 days after the Barbados agreement on electoral conditions, which was signed by both Venezuela's Unitary platform for the negotiation and by representatives of the Maduro regime. Although the agreement opened the door to international observers in the 2024 elections and led to the release of some political prisoners, it provides little clarity on the arbitrary disqualifications of opposition candidates. Just a day after the agreement, the U.S. government, and I know we're all tracking this, there's been a lot of talk about it and debate, the U.S. government eased sanctions on Venezuela, asserting that they would be reinstated, snapped back, if the Maduro regime fails to comply with its commitments. So a high level of uncertainty remains. Not only because moving toward free and fair elections requires that the regime implement a series of measures clearly laid out by the 2021 EU electoral observation mission, but also because many Venezuelans are facing practical obstacles to voting, including the devastating humanitarian crisis and difficulty accessing oil, which makes it more difficult for Venezuelans to move around the country, including to polling centers. So the events of last month of October have brought international attention back to Venezuela. Unfortunately, I think given what's going on in the world, it's not getting the attention that it deserves. So this provides, I think, a very important catalyst to explore challenges and opportunities for a democratic transition. For Venezuela to transition back to democracy, many steps are needed. Pushing for electoral conditions is key, but it's hard to believe that those in power are going to step down without clarity about what will happen the day after the elections. And I know Kamada is working a lot on this question. And also without knowing what a political and democratic coexistence would look like for Venezuelans. So a conversation about transition requires a serious discussion among stakeholders about creating incentives, including how to leverage US sanctions and international accountability for the gross violations of human rights and crimes like corruption, money laundering, among others. And if and once that happens, there's the longer term conversation pending about how to rebuild democratic institutions, which have been gutted, I'd say deliberately dismantled, and also how to regain control of the territory where organized crime and illegal armed groups operate with impunity. So to start delving into these very difficult questions, we have a truly outstanding panel today. We're going to have the opportunity to hear from María Corina Machado. This is the first time she's participating in an event like this since the election. Thank you so much for being here, María Corina. We'll also hear from opposition voices, analysts, civil society, and a representative from the negotiation delegation in Barbados. With that, I'm going to turn it over to Tamara Tarasu, who I want to announce is going to be moving to Washington, D.C. in January. And so we'll no longer have her working from Uruguay. And she will be moderating this conversation. Over to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, everyone, for coming and for joining us. Hola, María Corina, ¿nos escuchas bien?
Perfecto, Tamara.
Great. Entonces, we're gonna do this event in English. For those of you in the room, if you need simultaneous translation into Spanish, you can do that over Zoom. People in Zoom can pick the language through the platform. It's a true pleasure to be here to have this event with this panel. Our fourth panelist is on her way, arriving shortly. But the way we're gonna do this, we're gonna have a conversation first with María Corina, who is traveling, so we really appreciate you sorting through the technology and the travel to participate today. And as you know, I don't know if the people in this panel need introduction, but I'll introduce them as they start speaking. María Corina is the founder and national coordinator of Venezuela and the winner of the primaries on October 22nd to select a candidate for the elections next year in Venezuela. And María Corina, I have a few questions for you. The first one is pretty broad, but I think people here would want to hear from you. What do the primaries mean for Venezuela and what comes next? Pedro Zavars, what's up?
Thank you so much. I'm very grateful to the Inter-American Dialogue and Forma and all of you friends, people I respect so much, Tamara, Paola Bautista, of course, Mark Verstein, Laura Dib, and Claudia Niken. And I'm very grateful and honored to share with you this opportunity today. Wow, I think we're still in the process to assess what this huge citizen victory means and the impact it will have. I think this is before and after October 22nd in our struggle. I think it is an inflection point that will have, shock waves in the days to come. I think the primary had many results. And one of it, it's obvious, is the way Venezuelan society was awakened, inspired. We see hope growing, and we had a great citizen organization. Secondly, it helped us achieve a good coordination among different political groups and parties, and I'm grateful to have received the support and recognition of all the parties that participated in the primaries, and even of others that did not participate. Third, the huge turnout. I think no one expected this number of people voting all around the country. Brought a strong legitimacy to the leadership that now comes out of the process, and that needs to open and bring other groups and sectors together. Four, I would say we will now have a legitimate representation towards the international community. And finally, what we are all insisting on, we're looking towards the next stage, and we created strength, and it comes in many ways. I would say moral strength, because we feel more confident. We have trust in what we can do as individuals and as civil society, going over so many obstacles. And of course, now we have a huge agenda in front of us. It's only 12 months. Could seem long period for a conventional campaign, but this is not. And this means that we need to work in many different dimensions simultaneously, and there's no time to lose. So we're moving ahead, calling for a national alliance in which all sectors can be part of it. Second, we have to build an even stronger electoral apparatus. as we never had before. And third, we need to work on the global alignment of all stakeholders, conventional and non-conventional. And all this is happening among a very complex negotiation process. And I take the opportunity to recognize Dr. Gerardo Blythe and Teleniken for the the huge effort they've done so far.
Thank you. So Maria Corina, you received overwhelming support on October 22nd. That's a lot of people who voted, but there are a lot of people who did not vote that day. What would you tell them about the electoral process, the next few months? What do you think they should hear from you?
Well, Tamara, first of all, we need to put into context what this meant in terms of the turnout. We tend to talk about to the electoral registry, the whole universe, we mentioned that a number of 20.7 million people, but that's not true. Actually, at least 4.5 million Venezuelans that vote have left the country, perhaps even more. And we believe that close to 3 million people inside Venezuela actually do not vote where they live, either because they have moved voluntarily or because they have changed involuntarily. They were changed in the electoral registry. This means that we are roughly around 13 million. Actually, the true number of people that could vote in Venezuela, around 13 million people. So if we talk about a 2.5, at least 2.5 turnout, this means that we have 18.9 or even more % of the registry participating on October 22nd. And this is huge, huge, under any standards of a primary internationally, but even more given all the obstacles we face, the repression from the regime, no media whatsoever, threats, no resources. I mean, this is very important. As I said before, I think we are now having a shockwave in development, and a lot of people that didn't vote but saw the process. People might have had fear, might have doubts that the process could work and actually would be reliable. And I think we are all marveled, and this will bring a lot more people into the movement. But the most important thing regarding those who didn't participate is that we need to build trust, and we need to dismantle the regime's narrative in terms of our approach, how we've been portrayed. And actually, I think the primary is uniting the societies from down up, and this is very, very powerful. So we need to reach out, and not only Venezuelans who didn't vote, but also important international actors that not necessarily publicly supported the primary, but I know that they are impressed with what they've seen, and I'm talking about governments in the region and other sectors.
As Rebecca was saying earlier, you remain arbitrarily disqualified from running for office. You're not the only one. This has been used by authorities for quite some time in Venezuela. And there is the agreement in Barbados, which you mentioned, that has some language about reversing disqualifications. There's a little clarity about how that will happen. And I wonder if you can share with us some thoughts about what does all of this mean for your candidacy in a country like Venezuela?
Well, I would start by saying that I think from every perspective, it was a huge mistake from the regime and a very bad timing, because actually when they disqualified me, and actually I'm not even being notified. I mean, it was a third party that went to the Contraloría to ask about my status, and I've never been formally or legally notified of any of this process, which is absolutely totally unconstitutional. But I would say that it really backfired because it added an element of challenge of we were retando the system, you know, and the support grew enormously to our team, to our candidacy, as well as the international attention, because all this narrative that the regime had put into place that, you know, Maduro was unbeatable in 2024. Suddenly people say, wait, if they are going this far with something so obscene, it's because they're truly worried about this force and this movement that is growing. So I think that what, you know, others thought that it might be a strategy to weaken my support, and so I would get less votes. So in that sense, I don't think it worked at all. From now on, what I say is, look, this whole idea of the disqualifying issue was solved by 2.5 million people on October 22nd. It is a political issue, not a legal judiciary discussion. It is a political issue that, as you mentioned, is part of a complex negotiation process that the regime has incentives to move ahead. So I believe that what the US government has stated through the Secretary of State and other officials is clear. I trust that they will maintain what they have said regarding that free and fair elections can only be considered free and fair elections if that candidate, the candidate that has been chosen by the people, is allowed to completely and freely participate. So that's what we're concentrating right now, moving forward. And regarding the sentence of the Supreme Court, I think, as I said before, it's a huge mistake, and the regime has been repeating important mistakes that I think come out of their desperation, and in this case, because they never ever expected the level of turnout and participation, and they need to calm some of their followers.
María Corina, you talked earlier about coordination between political parties in the lead up to the primaries. And you know, there's a lot of conversation going on about the need for the opposition to rally behind a unified strategy. And there are, you know, people from different parts of the opposition here in the room. We have a full house. We have plenty of people online. There are also a lot of people who are listening now or would listen to this from Venezuela who are a little bit tired of politicians and politics, and their life get better. And I wonder what are your thoughts about that? What would you tell, you know, both the people that are in Venezuela and the opposition more generally in terms of next steps?
Okay, I lost part of your question, Tamara. Can you repeat the middle part? Because I don't want to miss that.
You know, there's a lot of conversation about the need to have a unified strategy for the opposition.
Okay.
And there's, you know, there are a lot of people here and online who may listen to this that are either belong to different parts of the opposition or people in Venezuela who just are tired of politics and they want to move ahead. What do you tell all of them?
Well, once again, let's understand what happened on October 22nd. I understand that many of these, you know, elements of the narrative could be accepted before this took place. You know, with a country that looked, you know, frustrated and even neutral to the political process a few months ago. But this is totally different reality now. And I want to insist in something that is very interesting. When you see the results of last Sunday, it's impressive how, you know, from rural areas, very small towns, to the biggest cities, the level of participation was huge, from poorest areas to middle income families. It was the same level of participation. I mean, actually, our strategy was in the campaign moving from out to in, from rural to urban areas, and from the most popular sectors, because I felt that this, we felt that the skepticism in the middle class was important, but the turnout was spectacular all across the board. So I want to say this because I find that Venezuela is uniting ourselves at the base of society, and this I said in regard to political parties as well. I mean, the basis of many political parties are participating with enthusiasm, even those parties that did not call for a strong participation in the process, but their militants did. So I realize we have now a huge challenge of, as I say, creating trust and showing that we are willing to open spaces of operations and actions and management of important sectors. As I said before, I do not believe in a criteria of quotas for parties. I think we need to work this based on merit and look for the best individuals that are willing to do their job and have the best knowledge in every single area, regardless of which party they come from, as long as they are truly committed with our objective, which is creating such a strong social movement in Venezuela and abroad that the regime will have to concede in the terms for a free and fair elections that will move us towards a peaceful transition to democracy. I'm not naive. I realize we are facing huge dangers, and there are many threats to our people. The regime will have a lot more resources once these licenses have been given, a lot more resources, economic, financial, and others. And we certainly need that all Democrats in our region, not only the political sector, but others as well, understand that it is in the best interest of all to favor and accompany and support this process. And I want to mention specifically even those governments that have been seen as traditionally closer to Maduro for ideological reasons or others, that it is also in their best interest. I'm talking about Mexico, Colombia, Chile, and Brazil, to favor this process and to accompany and support the Venezuelan people in this huge quest. But I'm sure that the end will be freedom and bringing back our children home, which is the huge desire of every single Venezuelan family nowadays.
Gracias, María Corina. I know you are on the road and made some space for this part of the conversation, so thank you. I think we got lucky with the internet in Venezuela with just one small glitch, so we're not gonna test our luck anymore. Thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Take care, all of you, and we'll hope to see you personally and hug you soon. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Now we're turning to our fantastic panel. We have Claudia online, and I'm going to introduce each of you as we start the conversation. We'll have some space for Q&A with the audience here, and the audience online can send your questions, and we're going to organizing the Q&A section, including questions from the audience online. To the panelists, we're using the room mics, so we need to speak loudly for the audience here to listen to us. And I'm going to start with Paola Aleman, who's the National Vice President for Political Education and Programs de Primero Justicia. Paola, bienvenida. My first question for you is, you just came from Venezuela. So what did you see in Venezuela on October 22nd. You also just published a book on transition and the transition in Venezuela. So, what does it mean? What happened in Venezuela and the primaries? What does this say regarding challenges and opportunities for a transition to democracy in Venezuela?
Hi, Tamara. Thank you very much for the invitation. It's a great honor to be here and be part of this panel. And I need to speak louder. Thank you very much. Sorry I came a little bit late. I was in a meeting with Georgetown students talking about the book, and that's why I came a little bit late. So, as María Corina said when she talked previously, it was a great day for our country on the primary day. And it reminded me a conversation we had with Felipe González on 2020, and that this conversation is the book that we edited. Julio Borges, who is sitting there, Miguel Mateus, that is over there too. And we were talking about the climate, the political climate of a transition. And he said something that I found it interesting, and I remember it last Sunday. And he said, if we have known how weak was the dictatorship, maybe we would have been more reckless in our actions. Because on primary day, we saw three things. We saw that the dictatorship made a mistake because they could stop the primary, and they didn't. And I'm gonna share with you a hypothesis about that. The second one is an opposition who knew how to create path of democratic residence, because we had a lot of obstacles to go to the primary, and every obstacle that we found on the way, the commission, the primary commission, and the political parties and the civil society found a way to move forward. And the third thing, and I think that is the most important, and I would like to share with you that experience that is absolutely touching, is that we have a country that is incredibly brave. We have a country that wants political change and that is willing to fight for it. So Nicolás Maduro made a miscalculation. He thought two things. He thought that opposition wasn't able to do a political event as the one that we had, that we would fail again. And he also thought that he had dominated the soul of our country, that people were not going to vote that day, that people were scared, disappointed, and they wouldn't vote. And he made a mistake. And that's why we had the primary election, and now we have this important moment, political moment in our country. And I would say that that's something that I saw that day that reminded me this quote of Felipe González, and it's like an important call to the political elite and economic elite in our country to start seeing with good eyes that country that we have in front of us.
Paula, I'm going to turn to Mark, who's the senior advisor on Latin America, on the Latin America program at USIP, at the Albert Stonebridge Group, and GBAO. Did I say that right? Good. Welcome, Mark. You've been following Venezuela for a long time, producing numbers, polling. What do you think we need to know in terms of numbers to set the conversation?
Well, first, I want to thank all of you who stayed after María Corina spoke. But I think my fellow panelists are definitely worth waiting for and listening to. I'm looking forward to learning a lot from them. I'm looking forward to their correcting me when I get things wrong. I know there are plenty of folks in the audience who'll be looking to do that as well. Thinking about you, Julio, probably a dozen others. But in terms of the polling, I think there are a few things I would highlight. First, the government is highly unpopular. I mean, that comes as a surprise. It's been true for a number of years, but it hasn't always been true. And when Maduro took office after Chavez's death, he had decent numbers. Won a presidential election. there were periods when, during Chavez was president, that he had very, very high levels of favorability, up to 60%. But for a number of years now, Maduro and the entire government have been very unpopular. They're at about 20%. I think they're pretty much at a floor and a ceiling. Maduro's numbers have been fairly consistent for some time. I know they're hoping that they'll get some sort of economic boost, according to reference the resources the government will get as a result of lifting of sanctions. I would not expect them to get a political boost from an improved economy. We'll have to see and track that. Last year, when the economy improved a bit, Maduro's numbers did not budge. At the same time, María Corina is very, very popular. And that's not been true. That's only true up until fairly recently. She's been a political figure for some 20 years. And for a long time, she had just a slice of the electorate. And the last couple of years, last few months, obviously she has just taken off. I think there are various reasons for that. When we first detected in the spring and May that she was going to win the primary and win it handily, and started sharing that with folks, there was a lot of doubt. Obviously, over time, other polls showed it as well, and she grew in support. Now she has majority support in the country, which is an extraordinary transformation. If the election were held today, if there were an election today between Maduro and María Corina, she would win a landslide. Would not matter what the conditions were for those elections. She would win. She would win handily. The other thing I think I would underscore strong commitment. We've heard this from our previous speakers. The strong commitment of the Venezuelan people to the election process. They very much believe that the elections are the best way to promote a democratic transition and change. And that has been true for some time. And as we saw on October 22nd, Venezuelans are prepared to overcome any sort of obstacles. I want to mention what a brave country it is. I think we saw that, and that comes through very much in the polling. People believe strongly that María Corina should have a right to run. They want her to fight for that right to run. They want the opposition to support her in that effort. That said, I think if it were necessary to make a compromise, I think Venezuelan people would be open to that. They are committed to seeing this electoral process through under almost any conditions, and would not support a boycott. Again, they want the opposition leaders to participate again under almost any conditions. In terms of the economy, most Venezuelans blame Maduro for the. I'm sorry. In terms of the economy, most Venezuelans blame Maduro for the economic crisis. They don't blame sanctions. They don't blame the United States. They don't blame the private sector. They blame on the government. In terms of sanctions, it's a little bit tricky to interpret the numbers. On the one hand, people feel that they are negatively impacted by the sanctions. The country's been negatively impacted, they themselves have been. And a lot depends on how you ask the question. If you ask people, should sanctions be lifted or should they be maintained? Most people say, by a large majority, say they should be lifted. But if you present the idea of conditioning lifting the sanctions in return for concessions the regime might make at the political realm, then there's more support for the idea of conditioning. In terms of negotiations, there's been long-time support for negotiations between the United States and the regime and between the opposition and the regime. We've not yet tested the Barbados agreement, but I'm confident we'll see how this plays out. But I'm confident that most Venezuelans will be supportive of the agreement that was just reached. There's one thing that brings all Venezuelans together. It is a desire for unity, and this has been a theme for some time. Chavez was president, polarizing the country, and had strong support. But we'd often hear in focus groups among Chavez supporters that they didn't like how he divided the country. And that really pained people on all sides. And what we've seen in focus groups today, what we see in the polling, whether you're testing messaging, polarizing messages versus more unifying messages, when you ask people about what they're looking for in a candidate, people are desperate for unity. And I think there's an important lesson there for the opposition, because they can polarize the electorate and they can win. But they would win by a larger margin if they have a more unifying message. And I think this is what María Corina is doing. I think it explains in part why she's doing so well. And of course, make it much easier to govern well. Runs some candidates. is runs based on a more unifying message. And then finally, I should note, public opinion can change. So, what I've just shared now could change over time. We'll have to monitor these various metrics. But one thing I think is particularly important to test in the coming weeks and months is something that we've been doing a lot of research on, is this idea of transitional justice, guarantees for regime, and guarantees for whoever loses the election. And I think it'll be important to understand how the Venezuelan people assess this issue of accountability versus reconciliation. Because any transitional justice plan, any sort of guarantees or governance, whatever it might be, needs to have public support to be sustainable. So I'm looking forward to testing that in the coming months. Sure.
Wonderful. Thank you, Mark. I'm gonna go back to Paola. I think we need the mics. We're not doing a great job with the volume. So, so better? I'm sorry. Tried. Okay. Paola, Mark would say people are desperate for unity. So I want to ask you, you're from a different political party than María Corina. And what's your take on what lies ahead for the Venezuelan opposition? What would you tell other politicians? What would you tell the Venezuelan people that they should expect from the opposition moving forward?
I think that's the main challenge. And it's the main challenge that we have in front of us, and that to build that we have pro-democratic learning over these 2 decades in the opposition. I mean, we are not starting from zero. We are starting for a little steps forward. And I think that we need to first build trust and confidence between the political actors. That's fundamental. We need to do that. And I think that these kind of events and meetings are very important to work together and to show us together. That's very important. The second step is transform that confidence in institutions, a place, a space where civil society and political parties can work together, create clear rules. And those spaces must be representative and that's hard. That's a tension between representativity and inclusiveness. And the third step is a place, a space that has more operative missions. Because if we're going to election in 2024 and we want to defeat Maduro, it's going to be an election with low or no competition. And we need that to have strong political parties, strong organizations, strong members who can be in the place where the citizens are going to vote, and they have to defend that will. So I think that the main, this is the main challenge that we have in front of us, that we need to build confidence and trust, and then transform that confidence into institutions.
I want to turn to Laura. Laura is the Venezuela Program Director at WOLA, the Washington office in Latin America, and she brings a very important voice of civil society to this conversation. So Laura, I'd love to move beyond politics and politicians, from which we've heard today, except for Mark. And I'd like to hear your take on what's happening in terms of human rights and the humanitarian situation in Venezuela. There was this perception of normalization for some time. It's sort of eroding. The situation is definitely far from normal. So can you share a little bit about what is happening today?
Yes, absolutely. Thank you, Tamara, and thank you to the Inter-American Dialogue for inviting me to participate in such an important conversation with very important panelists. I think I would like to start from the conclusion and then build up from that. And it's that there's a need to take care of the humanitarian and human rights situation in order to make political transition sustainable. And there's a lot of literature from other cases like South Africa and Colombia about this. And the reason why I'm talking about this is because in the case of Venezuela, the humanitarian situation is absolutely dire. And from my experience working with human rights victims for the majority of my career, I think that, or what I've heard from them is that they do not want revenge. Victims want some form of restorative justice, and they also want dignity in their life, which also includes having minimum decent conditions of life. So their kids can go to school, so they can afford groceries, they can have absolute access to their economic, social, and cultural rights. And I think that in that sense, it's important to keep in mind how victims of human rights violations, including economic, social, and cultural rights, and environmental rights, can play a positive role in the construction of solutions for Venezuela. As you said, there's nothing normal about the situation in Venezuela, and I would like to kind of like say that it was a myth, this idea that Venezuela was fixed, that Venezuela se arregló. The minimum wage right now in Venezuela is around $5, and the monthly cost for a family to just pay for groceries and basic goods and services is over $500. The interannual inflation rate in Venezuela exceeds 422%, which makes it impossible for people to have minimum conditions. According to the platform Venezuela, 19 million people are in humanitarian needs. And malnutrition and access to education are in the worst conditions. Kids are going to school only twice or 3 times a week just because their teachers cannot afford to go and teach. They have to take other jobs because their wage as teachers does not allow them to do that. So that means that the future of Venezuela is compromised right now. So there's a massive violation of economic, social, cultural, and environmental rights. And this has led to almost 1 million people to flee the country. And this is not even taking into account the situation of repression. And I would like to move to that. Venezuela is the only country in Latin America that has an open investigation before the International Criminal Court for potential crimes against humanity committed since 2014. And the fact-finding mission, the UN fact-finding mission, has said in their latest report that repression in Venezuela, I mean that there's a policy of repression and silencing the opposition, but also perceived opposition. And that's important because it's not just the members of political parties, it's human rights offenders, it's journalists, it's whoever is perceived as opposition. And the most important aspect, I think, from the latest report of the fact-finding mission is that because massive repression was so effective in the prior years, now the government can afford to do selective or targeted repression. But that doesn't mean that there's not a system in place that can, again, be activated if people go out to protest, if there are political events that are required to do so. So all of this to say is that the situation, the human rights situation, is very complicated. We have rampant impunity. The judiciary is conformed of over 80%. I think almost the totality of the members of the judiciary are have been named temporarily, which means that they can be removed at any time. There's no independence and impartiality. So in the case of a transition, we're going to have to think about building a car and driving it at the same time. We need to rebuild those institutions, as you were saying, and at the same time addressing the needs of the people and not thinking that economic, social, and cultural rights are just, oh, that's something that we can get to after after we build the transitions. It's going to have to be something done all at the same time. And that's going to be very complicated. And I think it's going to be important to transmit to the Venezuelan people what their expectations can be, because the depth of the economic crisis is so complicated that it's probably not going to be something that is going to happen in the short run.
Thank you, Laura. And clearly Venezuela is a country where we are seeing three simultaneous crises that you talked about, right? The humanitarian crisis, the crackdown on dissent, broadly speaking, not just against the opposition, it's ongoing, and the consequent migration crisis. You were just close to the border between Colombia and Panama. There's the Darien Gap there, which poses enormous challenges to an increasing number of Venezuelans who are crossing through the gap. So I wondered if you could share a little bit about your thoughts in terms of what's happening with Venezuelan migration today. You mentioned huge number of Venezuelans who have left. And also, we're here in Washington, clearly migration is an issue for the US government and this administration. So what are your thoughts in terms of challenges related to Venezuelan migration?
Yeah, thank you so much. Well, the first thing I think it would be interesting for our audience to know that before joining WOLA, I was in Colombia for 5 years working for migrants and refugees. And Colombia has received over 35% of the population that has left the country. So there's a lot of pressure in Colombia and in Colombian authorities because of the amount of people that have left. And what I can say from that experience is that the majority of people leave because of humanitarian reasons. They leave because their kids couldn't go to school, because they couldn't access a medical treatment. That was a lot of the cases. The majority of the cases that I attended to were cases of access to health. But then when you started speaking to people and doing interviews in depth, you realize that somebody's cousin was killed because of generalized violence, or in one of those OLP or Operación Liberación del Pueblo, or somebody's family member was in prison for political reasons. So you started talking about the economic situation, and then when you went deeper, you realize that people are also fleeing because of that repression. Now, in terms of what's happening in the U.S. southern border, it is important to recognize that migration brings a lot of pressure into governments. And usually what happens is that the cities are in charge, or the municipalities, the local governments are in charge of providing services for that population, education, health, access to all of their rights. But sometimes that is not accompanied by a national policy of integration, of access to legal pathways. And that becomes more complicated for those local governments. And in turn, then this brings political conflict. And it's kind of what we saw in New York a couple of weeks ago. But that also happens a lot in Colombia and in other countries. In September, the number of Venezuelans arriving to the southern border was historic. And for the first time, it outdid the number of Mexicans arriving to the US. So that's something that has never happened before. It was over 66,000 people, Venezuelan people, crossing that border. The other interesting thing that I found on the strip, my colleague Adam Isaacson from WOLA as well, and we went to Negotiation and Maduro, which are two local municipalities from where people take the boats that take them to Capurganá or Acandí, and then they start the road through the Darien Gap. And there are two things that I would like to highlight. The first one is that it's a statistic of around 50% and 50%. People they're coming from Colombia, Ecuador, and Peru. I mean, the Venezuelans are coming from third countries, which also speaks about their policies of integration and the capacity to build a future in those countries. Or, which is, the people that I interviewed when I was there, they're coming directly from Venezuela, migrating for the first time. And that also speaks about the complicated situation that they're in right now. So all of this to say is that first, we need to be mindful of how this crisis can be used in the political context. And remember that in 2024, the US is going to presidential elections. And, it's often politicians use migrants as kind of like not in the most positive and constructive way, I would say. And second, I would say that it's important to take a multilateral approach. In the case of the US, from the WOLA perspective, we welcomed the redesignation of the TPS for people that had entered the country before July 31st. But we were also critical of the decision to deportate people to Venezuela after that date, because the humanitarian situation has not changed, because the United States continues to have to respect the principle of non-refoulement, which means that you cannot deport people to a country where their lives or their freedom could be at risk. But it's important to keep in mind that even though this is a human rights aspect, there is always also a political perspective or aspect to it, and until there is a democratic transition in Venezuela, we're still going to continue to see people to flee.
Thank you, Laura. So talking about the US government, I'm going to go back to you, Mark, and ask you, there has been a parallel negotiation between US authorities and Venezuelan authorities, on parallel tracks with the Barbados agreement, that talked about easing sanctions in exchange of specific concessions. As you were talking about earlier, after the primaries, the government went against the primary results, against the leaders who organized the primaries. What does that mean? Where does this leave the US government, right? What is the starting point for the concessions? We are 10 steps back from where we were before the primaries. Are the concessions just getting us closer to where we were before? What does the US government need to do? What's your take on that?
Sure. Well, thank you for the question. First, I think it's important for any non-Venezuelan to approach Venezuela with a great dose of humility. And that's especially true for current policymakers and foreign policymakers. I can assure you, former White House staffers are especially full of humility. But so, I think that for a quarter century now, the United States has been grappling with how to engage Venezuelan government, first under Chavez and under Maduro. And I think every administration has failed up until now. I think the Bush administration certainly didn't achieve their objective. I think during the Obama years, we frankly fell short. I think the Trump approach was a failure. The Trump administration officials would acknowledge. So I think that the Biden administration has an opportunity to succeed where all of its predecessors fell short. And I would argue that they've already achieved a fair amount by using diplomacy, by leveraging the sanctions, a number of things that were achieved in the Barbados agreement. First, a primary took place on October 22nd, and that I think that primary would not have taken place were it not for the negotiation between the United States and the regime. There is an electoral time frame in place. General idea appears as if the election would take place next October, at least in the second half of the year. Election observers are arriving in the country as we speak. The Carter Center is there, and political prisoners have been released, and I expect more to be released in the coming weeks. So that's a long list. It's not just a matter of promises the Biden administration got; they got real commitments and real actions. That said, things can go awry very quickly. We can walk out of this room right now and find out that things have fallen apart. And I think the reaction of the primary has been dangerous and worrisome. It's obviously a reflection of how worried the regime is because the primary was so successful. But I think a lot depends on what happens in the coming days. Will they just continue with the rhetoric? Will it just be investigations? Or will they take it a step further and make arrests? And if they do that, obviously, I think the process would probably fall apart. Now, the United States still has leverage. We've all read the Blinken document. And by the end of November, political prisoners need to be released. U.S. nationals who are justly held need to be released. And there needs to be a process and timeline to allow all candidates, María Corina, to run the election. And then of course, there's a 6-month marker when the licenses for engagement in the oil industry and gold and secondary bond trading would have to be renewed. And as Rebecca noted earlier, there's a lot of uncertainty. And I think investors are uncertain. So I don't expect there to be much new investment in the coming months, or really for the next year. That said, I think the regime certainly have a certain amount of resources that they don't currently have. So the question is, what happens if the regime does not comply? And I think, and the administration has been fairly public about this, I don't think they tend to return to the status quo. They believe that the policy they inherited, sanctions, are harmful, have been harmful and counterproductive. They've been harmful to the Venezuelan people, and obviously Maduro, as we discussed earlier, is responsible for the economic crisis, but the sanctions clearly made things worse there. So Venezuelans are worse off as a result of sanctions. That's led to increased migration. We've also seen bad actors engage in the oil and gas market, in the gold industry, and the secondary bond market as well. And there's less oil in the market, which is not good for less gasoline consumers or consumers around the world. So I think that the question is, I think the administration will be trying to think through is, what's the right sanctions regime today? Given the current situation, what would a smart approach look like? And I don't think it'll look like what was imposed in 2019 by the Trump administration. And I think it's important to keep in mind the genesis of the sanctions in 2019. We tend to treat them as a sort of natural and immutable feature of the U.S.-Venezuelan relationship. But the Trump administration was hesitant to impose the sanctions on the oil industry. They described it as the nuclear option because they were afraid that it would crash the economy more so than it already crashed, and that it would not produce regime change. And that's what happened. But they took the gambit. They recognized Guaido and they imposed the sanctions. And there was a certain logic to it at the time, but they expected it would work in a matter of days, a matter of weeks, months at the most. But it didn't work. I don't think they imagined that 5 years later, these sanctions would still be in place. So just because they made sense at a certain moment in 2019 doesn't necessarily mean that they make sense at a very different time in Venezuela, very different conditions in the world, and a time in which the opposition was very positioned very differently. So in short, I think there will be a lot of discussion in the administration about what the right approach should be. But again, I don't think it will look like what we had a few weeks ago.
Thank you, Mark. Well, that's also because sanctions shouldn't be an end in and of themselves, but rather a tool in a broad toolbox. We've been talking a lot about the negotiations. I'd like to turn to Claudia. Claudia Niken is the executive secretary of the delegation of the Unitary Platform of Venezuela. She was actually involved in the negotiations. So I think it would be very helpful for all of us, Claudia. Can you just share with us your take of what does the Barbados agreement mean for the negotiation process? What are your key messages about that? And welcome.
Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very grateful for the organization of this event and for the invitation to participate in it. I'm sorry, but I will continue in Spanish from here. And tomando lo que pude escuchar de la intervención de Mark, pues efectivamente tenemos pues una negociación compleja, digamos, a varios niveles y a varios pasos. Me preguntas específicamente qué significa el acuerdo de Barbados para el proceso de negociación y cuáles son mis conclusiones más importantes. Ese acuerdo de Barbados, o llamado acuerdo de Barbados, en realidad es el acuerdo parcial sobre la promoción de derechos políticos y garantías electorales para todos. Y yo creo que es una muestra de que trabajar de manera constante y persistente, con paciencia estratégica, llevando un día a la vez y sin perder de vista el objetivo, rinde frutos. Fueron 26 meses de negociaciones formales e informales muy complejas para dar un primer paso, consciente y firme, eso sí, en la construcción del camino que permitirá o debe permitir al país, no sin obstáculos ni dificultades, avanzar hacia la restauración de la democracia. Es un acuerdo inicial, no pretende ser otra cosa. Su finalidad es desarrollar parcialmente los temas de derechos políticos y garantías electorales con miras a la elección presidencial de 2024, a partir de los puntos 1 y 2 de la agenda acordada en el memorando de entendimiento suscrito en Ciudad de México el 13 de agosto del 21 con la facilitación del Reino de Noruega. No tengo tiempo aquí para explicar el contenido del acuerdo, por lo que me voy a limitar a expresar algunos puntos fundamentales, comenzando por dos reflexiones. La primera es que sin el acuerdo, probablemente la elección primaria que estamos celebrando aquí hoy no se habría producido. Ahora hay que proteger sus efectos. Y lo segundo es que antes del acuerdo, aunque estén en la Constitución y la ley, no existía el compromiso expreso de Nicolás Maduro y su gobierno de respetar los derechos políticos tal como se abordaron, ni de ofrecer las garantías electorales que allí se establecen. Eso no quiere decir que la brega no continúe. Dicho esto, voy simplemente a enunciar algunos puntos fundamentales del acuerdo, más allá del compromiso asumido por las partes de reconocer y respetar el derecho de cada actor político de seleccionar su candidato para las elecciones presidenciales de manera libre y conforme a sus mecanismos internos. Comienzo por los derechos políticos. El acuerdo versa específicamente sobre el derecho y libertad de sufragio y la libertad de asociación política en el marco de la elección presidencial. En lo que respecta a la libertad de sufragio, se produjo el compromiso, que parece que hay que poner de relevancia de manera sistemática, de promover un discurso público y un clima político y social favorable al desarrollo de un proceso electoral pacífico y participativo, que implica el respeto a la ciudadanía, la autoridad electoral, los actores políticos y el rechazo de cualquier forma de violencia en el ejercicio político. Además, se acordó la participación de todos los medios de comunicación nacionales e internacionales en la cobertura de la campaña electoral y en ese marco promover el equilibrio e igualdad de acceso a los medios públicos y privados de todos los candidatos. Eso no existe hoy. En cuanto al derecho al voto, se dio especial importancia a la actualización y depuración del registro electoral. Con relación al registro y voto en el exterior, el compromiso es sujetarse a la Constitución y la ley, lo que se traduce en la búsqueda de una solución para garantizar y no para limitar el derecho al sufragio de quienes han dejado el país. Con respecto al derecho a ser elegido para ocupar cargos públicos, el énfasis estuvo evidentemente en lo que se llamó autorización de toda persona que estando arbitrariamente sometida a una inhabilitación administrativa quiera postular su candidatura a la elección presidencial. El acuerdo se refiere a los procedimientos judiciales o administrativos que con celeridad, eficiencia y eficacia sean aplicables para eso. Lo mismo respecto a la libertad de asociación política, en tanto que se persigue la búsqueda de una solución para los partidos que han sido objeto de medidas judiciales o administrativas que de diversas maneras les impiden hoy participar libremente en ese proceso. En el ámbito de las garantías electorales, como se dijo más temprano, uno de los logros más importantes se refiere a la invitación de misiones internacionales de observación técnica electoral, específicamente las de la Unión Europea, el panel de expertos de la ONU y el Centro Carter, entre otras, para que participen en el proceso a partir de la convocatoria de la elección, lo que supone, entre otras cosas, presenciar todas las auditorías que se harán sobre el sistema, lo que es otra garantía, particularmente sobre el registro electoral. Hay muchas otras garantías en el acuerdo. Hago énfasis en el compromiso de reconocer el resultado de las elecciones, lo que en Venezuela va mucho más allá del discurso y debe traducirse en hechos muy concretos. Para terminar de responder, quiero subrayar dos cosas que tienen particular relevancia. La primera es el compromiso de que lo acordado, en materia de derechos y garantías se extienda y desarrolle con relación a las elecciones parlamentarias, estadales y municipales que deben tener lugar en 2025. Y lo segundo es la manifestación expresa de la voluntad de las partes de dar continuación al proceso de diálogo y negociación, tal como está planteado en el memorando de entendimiento, con énfasis en la necesidad de acordar otras medidas orientadas al fortalecimiento de una democracia inclusiva y una cultura de tolerancia y convivencia política, así como de respeto a los derechos humanos.
Gracias, Claudia.
Mm.
¿Me escuchas?
Sí, sí.
Bueno, hablabas de un acuerdo inicial, nos diste un montón de detalles. ¿Qué consiste ese acuerdo inicial? ¿Qué es lo que podemos
Ujú.
como que vaya a ocurrir próximamente? O sea, ¿qué es lo que se viene con respecto al acuerdo y la negociación?
Mm. Bueno, para responder esa pregunta, tenemos que ponernos en perspectiva, ¿no? El proceso de negociación comenzó formalmente en agosto de 2021 y además del memorando de entendimiento se han producido 5 acuerdos, 2 en materia de protección de intereses vitales de la nación, 2 en materia de protección social del pueblo venezolano, particularmente el que prevé la creación del llamado Fondo Social, y el acuerdo sobre promoción de derechos políticos y garantías electorales para todos. La ejecución de esos acuerdos y del memorando de entendimiento cabalga o debe cabalgar en paralelo, por lo que es difícil hacer una lista de tareas aquí, ¿no? En materia electoral, los pasos a seguir son bastante claros. Los hay de cortísimo, corto, mediano y largo plazo, teniendo la delegación de la plataforma unitaria la carga especial de hacer lo necesario para que el acuerdo se cumpla, pues su ejecución mayormente está en manos de instituciones del Estado, particularmente del Consejo Nacional Electoral. Adicionalmente, están pendientes, por ejemplo, la conformación del grupo de amigos y la constitución de mecanismos de participación de otros actores políticos y sociales en el proceso, ambos asuntos previstos en el memorando de entendimiento. Además, luego del visto bueno del secretario general de las Naciones Unidas para la constitución del Fondo Social, evidentemente hay que retomar los trámites para materializarlo. Dicho esto, bueno, queda claro que falta mucho por hacer para alcanzar el objetivo final descrito en el memorando de entendimiento, es decir, un acuerdo integral que establezca reglas claras de convivencia política y social, desarrollando todos los puntos de la agenda acordada, que si pudiéramos poner la lámina, solo para ponerla de fondo, pues les traigo para que tengan conciencia, ¿no? del tamaño de esa agenda y del contenido de la agenda. Y no puedo terminar sin advertir lo siguiente, ¿no? En el memorando de entendimiento es bastante elocuente la decisión de instaurar un proceso de diálogo y negociación integral e incremental con el objetivo de llegar a un acuerdo para establecer reglas claras de convivencia política y social con respeto absoluto a la Constitución Nacional, tras el reconocimiento, entre otras cosas, de la necesidad de construir una visión de un futuro conjunto para todas las venezolanas y todos los venezolanos. Eso muestra, en primer lugar, que las partes reconocen que no hay en Venezuela la visión de un futuro conjunto para todos los venezolanos, a lo cual se suma la ausencia de reglas claras de convivencia política y social. Más allá de eso, una lectura global del memorando de entendimiento permite identificar los 2 grandes pilares del proceso: el quebrantamiento de los principios fundamentales de un Estado democrático de derecho y el sufrimiento del pueblo venezolano en virtud del descalabro de la economía, lo cual, vale decir, es consecuencia de lo anterior. A partir de allí, las partes aceptaron sentarse como iguales en una mesa de diálogo y negociación, sin aparecer como vencedores o vencidas, pero asumiendo que hay que transformar el régimen político actual con base en un acuerdo que desarrolle la agenda contenida en el memorando de entendimiento, lo que permite inferir la intención de las partes de construir, a falta de mejor término, una transición. Esa es la tarea pendiente. En complemento, subrayo que del memorando de entendimiento resulta claro que las partes en la negociación, el así denominado Gobierno de la República Bolivariana de Venezuela y la Plataforma Unitaria de Venezuela, aceptan que no son los únicos actores de la transformación, cuando en el punto 4 de los términos generales se expresa que deben establecerse mecanismos de participación de otros actores políticos y sociales. De ahí lo esencial de establecer esos mecanismos. A fin de cuentas, la experiencia dice que procesos políticos como este requieren acuerdos y bases comunes, por lo que todos los actores relevantes, comenzando por las partes de la negociación, tienen que identificar reglas de juego comunes que sirvan como contrato de confianza entre ellos para que la transformación sea viable. Sin eso no hay ni puede haber cambio. En ese sentido, quiero traer a colación una observación de Pedro Niquen con relación a las guerras civiles que tuvieron lugar a finales del siglo pasado en El Salvador y Guatemala, señalando que la meta es que adversarios, en aquel caso se refería a enemigos, se levanten de la mesa de negociación, y cito, como aliados en un proyecto nacional de dimensión histórica determinado no por el mero silencio de las armas, sino por una profunda transformación institucional, una revolución negociada. Dicho eso, y ya para terminar, concluyo subrayando que se nos hace imprescindible comprender y asumir que tenemos la oportunidad de construir en Venezuela un proyecto común de país que conlleve una profunda transformación institucional y también social. Eso requiere la conquista de la esperanza, de una que, como también lo dijo Pedro Niquen, se edifique sobre el propósito mancomunado de recuperar para el pueblo la justicia, la libertad y sobre todo la dignidad. Muchas gracias.
Gracias, Claudia. Thank you, everyone. And I think because there's a majority of Venezuelans in this panel, we're over time, of course. But I do want to leave some time for questions and answers. So I would say, let's take one round of questions from the room. And I have a few here from Zoom. And then I'll give each of you a few minutes to wrap up answering whatever questions you want to address. Let's start. There are questions there? Here, this side. The mic is on its way. Gracias, Bernardo.
Hello, pleasure to hear you guys. Just a very quick question. We haven't really talked about the results of the primary, talked about the turnout. María Corina got more than 90% of the vote, which is something that's almost like a black swan event in my mind, but I'd love if the panel could discuss a little bit about how to interpret the results and what do they think it means for Venezuelan society and politics moving forward. Is it a game changer? And then second, also very quickly, if there are any thoughts on or any insights into why U.S. is giving so much weight into the oil production of Venezuela. Most estimates say that in the next 12 months, we're only talking about a 200,000 barrel a day increase, which is really a drop in the bucket when it comes to prices or even energy consumption. So I'm curious if there's any insights on why they're giving so much weight to that production. Thank you.
Great.
Thank you. No, and congrats to the dialogue and to the panelists for an excellent presentation. I wanted to ask a specific question for Claudia, if she can. You mentioned that this began with the signing of the Memorandum of Understanding in August of 2021. Since then, you know, for the last over 2 years, we've heard repeatedly that this negotiations process is going nowhere, that you know, this is a waste of time and that it's, you know, essentially going to end in failure. And yet we saw on October 17th the announcement of this agreement, which, as Mark said, is historic and gets things that that weren't in place before in terms of democratic concessions. So I'm wondering, for Claudia in particular, but to the other panelists, what can we do to bet on the success of this process, and particularly to strengthen it and shield it for the turbulence that we're likely to see moving forward? Thanks.
So, any other questions on that side of the room? No? Okay, so I'll just add a few here which we got online for all of you. Given the spirit of compromise and the agreement between the government and the opposition, is it tactically wise to call referring Maduro to the International Criminal Court? Does that not guarantee that, I would say, Maria Corina, I think, her candidacy will be voided by the government? Second question. Yeah, so does sending Maduro to the ICC guarantee that Maria Corina Machado's candidacy will be voided by the government? Next question is, what is the process to try to determine what, if any, implications this week's ruling by the Supreme Court to challenge the primary results will have on the Barbados agreement? What would determine whether the government's actions constitute a breach of their commitments? And what would be the timeline for this? And what would it look like? Related to that, can the end of November deadline be enforced? And if so, how? Ola, do you want to start?
Well, thank you very much for the questions. First, how to see the results, right? I think that the first thing that we learned on Sunday is that the country is alive, that the country wants political change, and the country is willing to fight for it. And also, that vote behind that vote that was a testimony of bravery, a testimony of free conscience, there is also a message to opposition. Yes, and it is that the country wants an opposition that confronts injustice. Among different months, we have heard that the country didn't want polarization, that the country didn't want to fight with the dictatorship, that we needed to be moderated with the things that we were seeing in the streets. And I think that this is a clear message that the country wants political change, even though it takes sacrifices. And that's an important message to us, to the opposition and to the dictatorship. Also, I think another thing that was really special on Sunday was the organization of the political parties. Even though political parties are going through a representation crisis, political parties are the hands and the soul of the process, because in every table where you were to vote, there was a militant of a political party. Primero Justicia has representation and has people who were working in every table. More than 10,000 justicieros and justicieras were in the field. And they were working even though we didn't have a candidate. And that's amazing. Because when you are part of a political party, you work for your political party, and that's good. That's why we exist. So I think that those are the things that we learned that day, and it's very important to reflect on that. The other thing about the negotiation, I'm not a specialist in negotiation. Also, I live in Caracas and I want to go back there, so I won't talk very much about that. But I know one thing. I know that the negotiation is stronger if we have civil society and political parties in the field, raising their voices. If we don't exist, the negotiation is between the elites. It's between United States, the dictatorship, and we are not there. If we want to be in the table, we need to be strong on the streets.
Thank you, Paola. Laura? Yeah, thank you for the questions. I'm going to address some of them, and I would just like to start by referring to something that you said, and it's the Memorandum of Understanding that was signed in 2021 establishes in its fourth point the creation of a consultation mechanism that is supposed to be inclusive. And it's important to move forward in that sense and start thinking about how civil society and human rights victims can be heard in the context of negotiation. And I'll go back to one of the points that I did in my presentation, and is that because Venezuelans in general do not want revenge, or the majority of the people do not want revenge, they want to build a society, they want to have human dignity respected, just as a basic matter of principle, a mechanism of consultation that is inclusive, that includes women, vulnerable groups, such as LGBTQI, indigenous communities. Those voices can actually play a constructive role. So I would just encourage the people involved in the negotiation to think forward in the creation of this mechanism. And I would tie this to Jeff's question about how to move forward and how to shield these negotiations. And I would just say that it was really interesting to see in Barbados the presence of other countries, such as Brazil, Colombia, Argentina, France. So these are countries that could play a very important role in holding accountable the parties to their commitments. So I think that it's important to, yes, to move forward in a perspective in which the recovery of democracy in Venezuela is not just a matter of Venezuela. It's also, it has an impact in the region. Migration has an impact in the region, and therefore these countries, especially neighboring countries like Colombia and Brazil, could play a very important role. In the case of the question of the ICC, I would just like to clarify something, and it's that it's very important because this is such, sometimes, we lawyers are not simple in our language. And the ICC has become a very complex issue to kind of translate into a language that everybody can understand. Right now, the International Criminal Court has not opened cases. It has opened an investigation. That means that no responsibility can yet be attributed, a criminal responsibility, and therefore it's not like we're going to see Maduro tomorrow in prison in The Hague. So it's important to kind of lower a little bit the expectations, understand that the ICC has very slow times in which they work in. And also, we're still not there yet. No cases have been created, so that's important to keep in mind. And the other thing is that the ICC, because Venezuela is a party to the Rome Statute, it's an independent organ of international justice. So this is not something that can be a part of the negotiations. The only scenario in which the ICC could close its investigation is if, under the principle of complementarity, Venezuela is actually investigating crimes against humanity, which is not something that we're going to see in the short run. And just a little comment on the question about the November deadline. I think it's interesting to read that statement of Secretary Blinken with, reading in between the lines. And it doesn't say that it's a deadline. It said that the United States has the expectation that first there will be that a mechanism would be established to review those political disqualifications, and second, that the release of political prisoners will start. So I don't think that's a deadline, and I don't think that the United States is necessarily going to lift that sanction before April of next year, but just a thought. Thank you, Laura. I'll turn to Claudia now. Claudia.
Aquí estoy. Bueno, la verdad es que creo que la pregunta que particularmente me hicieron ya la respondieron Paola y Laura, y muy bien, ¿no? Yo creo que el proceso de negociación ha sido un proceso largo, complicado, lleno de obstáculos, de retrocesos, de avances, y que simplemente sin el apoyo de o sin la participación activa de los partidos y de la sociedad civil en el proceso, no en la mesa de negociación, sino en el proceso político que supone que tiene que estar detrás de eso, más allá de mecanismos de efectiva comunicación, como los hay en algunos casos, pero en otros no, no aún. Es la manera de fortalecer este proceso de negociación, como lo decía Paola, que al final es el proceso de negociación entre venezolanos, ¿no? Para resolver nuestra crisis muy profunda, política, social y económica. Y eso, bueno, eso pasa por formalizar algo que, por no ser formal, ocurre de una manera no regular y no como tendría que ser, que es el tema de los mecanismos de participación de otros actores políticos y sociales en el proceso para fortalecer justamente no solo la toma de decisiones el contenido de esas decisiones, sino al final la legitimidad de las decisiones que se toman, ¿no? Eso es fundamental. Pero además, como también creo que era Laura que lo mencionaba, el papel de la comunidad internacional es fundamental y la verdad es que en Barbados es la primera vez que estamos acompañados por un número muy importante de países, no solo por los acompañantes y por el facilitador, sino que hubo presencia de, bueno, representaciones importantes de países de la región, sobre todo, que habían estado ausentes desde hace un tiempo considerable del proceso político y que ojalá desde la cercanía justamente ideológica, si queremos verlo de esa manera, con el régimen, puedan traerlo o llevarlo hacia la democracia, ¿no? Porque claramente a la izquierda democrática no le interesa tener en sus filas un representante que no sea, usando sus términos, tan democrático como ellos o como ellos pretenden ser. Entonces, eso es muy importante y fue bastante significativo. Al final, si queremos que este acuerdo electoral, digamos, funcione, en general todos ellos, pero el electoral en particular por lo que por el tema que estamos discutiendo hoy, yo creo que hay que darle el chance, hay que dar la oportunidad. Hay un discurso oficial que siempre va a hacer ver que el otro no cumplió. Es una forma de hacer las cosas con la que yo no estoy de acuerdo, simplemente manifiesto un análisis, ¿no? Y yo espero que los ataques que ha habido a las primarias, pues dejen de aumentar, disminuyan y finalmente desaparezcan. Pero al final hay que dar una oportunidad. Uno no puede salir de primeras a decir, ven, cumplieron el acuerdo, quiten la licencia de una vez. No, han pasado 15 días. Hay que permitir que los procesos ocurran. Y yo creo que en eso también tanto los actores nacionales, los protagonistas de este acuerdo, que por cierto no es la delegación, nosotros somos una delegación, sino los partidos que están detrás de esta delegación, que son la plataforma unitaria al final, pues lo soporten y, y sigan soportándolo como hasta ahora, apoyándolo como hasta ahora, y transmitir a la sociedad nacional e internacional que hay que resistir y seguir y trabajar para la implementación y la ejecución de este acuerdo y de todos los que se han ya suscrito y de los que vienen, porque faltan muchos todavía, falta muchísimo. Muchas gracias.
Yes, Claudia. Mark?
Well, panelists gave very complete answers. Just say a couple things on on a few of the questions. First, with regarding to Maria Corina, I mean, first, the result is a credit to her and her political skill and her teams. But I think importantly, it makes it much more difficult for her not to be the candidate. It would be one thing if she'd won, 40% to 30%, but winning 93% of the vote is pretty impressive. So I think it's made it more difficult for those in the opposition for that she not be the candidate who were talking about Plan B, succession plans many months ago, and those voices have been quieted, and I think will be quieter for some time. Ultimately, we'll see what the regime does with regard to her ability to run, and if she can't run, whether she decides to support someone else. But I think those discussions are premature at this point. On the issue of oil, I agree that the impact on gasoline prices is relatively small in the short term, but there is potential production in Venezuela, and in a very uncertain global market. I think the U.S. administration is looking for answers from various countries. Only one country is going to answer, but Venezuela can contribute. I think they would view that as helpful. And if there are more resources in Venezuela, that might could mean less migration over the next year. With regard to the ICC, yeah, I mean, the regime faces a lot of threats. There's the ICC, there's the State Department bounty, Department of Justice indictments, there's potential investigations within Venezuela if the opposition were to win. And the opposition, I think, is prepared to negotiate all these issues, but as Laura was saying, written, they're very, very, very complicated. And then finally, on the November deadline, the word we're using, I agree it's a low bar. I think I'm hoping that the regime will meet that low bar. I think the real test will come afterward.
Thank you, Mark. So to wrap up, I'll just say, obviously, the conversation about elections is key. We talked a lot about that, the negotiations and what's happening, and to keep pushing for as close to free and fair elections as possible. But there's a much broader conversation about transition and what's next for Venezuela. And we touched upon a lot of those issues, right? What is the next day going to look like? How do we rebuild institutions? How do you regain control of certain parts of the country that are now under the control of armed groups? And all of that is a huge conversation. We need to figure out how to get there. So using leverage and incentives, US sanctions is one of them. International accountability is another one that we need to thinking about to be able to get actors to commit to get to the elections and to move forward. So I want to thank everyone for joining us. For the Venezuelans in the room, it's 4:35, finished a golpe de las 4:30, so almost. Thank you very much for coming. It's been a pleasure to moderate this panel with this great panelists. Thank you.